Okay, so we're around at Nick Jolliffe's and it's Bryan Pepperell, Bryan and Nick. We're having another wrap. Nick and I have been out having a coffee and we're going to pick up, I suppose, where we left off really.
Well, yeah, I suppose looking at the camera over here is quite interesting. We're actually having a cup of tea. Coffee was enough, but we're into tea right now.
You might have to speak up a bit.
I'm going to speak up and look into my cup of tea and look at you. We're at my place, so it's a change of venue to last time. Tonight is the night before the New Zealand election, and I hope some of you viewers are actually New Zealanders, but it'd be nice to think most of you aren't. It's an interesting night because here in New Zealand we're facing the same kind of election that countries all around the world are going to be having. And they're going to be elections which are marred with our desire for being at the party we were at and staying at that party and enjoying the party. And on the way back up the hill, Bryan and I were talking about the role of Cassandras and how it's sometimes it's quite hard to be a Cassandra because you can actually see what's coming up and you'll state it, but it won't fit in with how people feel about things. It'll only basically get their backs up. And this election's very interesting. I'm going to get Bryan to comment in a minute as to the sort of the background to the immediate future to this election. I'll give you a hint. The hint is that we've got commercial devastation worldwide, and we have probably the greatest economic catastrophe being foisted upon us since the 1930s. So, having said that, I'll get your take on it, Bryan.
Well, it's not just about New Zealand, Nick. I think it's actually kind of like a global thing, but New Zealand has always been at the forefront of doing daft things, okay? Like, you know, we were really early on into this whole thing of privatising the profit and socialising the losses.
Yeah.
And selling off our silver. And I guess, you know, a sort of rape and plunder of publicly owned property. All around the world, this tug of war has been going on for some time. But it's reached a bit of a high point, and I guess coinciding with another incredible event, because Nick was just saying, oh, well, you know, the price of oil's on the up again, but basically about 2005, I think we crossed the threshold, or we peaked with our oil production, and so from there on, the story would only be bad news.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, this whole struggle in sort of basic terms between the barons and the peasants, you know, you just recast it in different ways and it repeats itself. And unfortunately, and Nick was reminding me of this, you've got a whole generation that's actually not actually been able to learn from the mistakes of the past, and also the public memory doesn't seem to be very long, does it? The collective memory.
No. Well, I suppose the collective memory, when we think about the financial situation, what we've seen on Wall Street and throughout the financial capitals of the world is this increasing domination of a kleptocratic system where insider trading is part of the game, knowing what's going to happen next because you set it up to happen and you're reaping the rewards for yourself and becoming progressively more wealthy on paper while everyone else suffers. It's led to this very strange generational happening. And I hark back to the late 60s when the hippies were in vogue, and they wanted a revolution. They didn't really know what they wanted, a bit of flower power, and they wanted the world to be a nicer, better place. And officially they were rejecting conservative middle-class values, and they went off and became people like Bill Gates and so on, and became extremely wealthy and lost all that idealistic fervour. And what we've seen is these people coming out on Wall Street, occupiers, and the occupiers right around the world. And I've seen some commentaries, and I tend to agree with them, which say they're the opposite to hippies. They want to be middle class. They actually want things to be right. They want a future like their parents had before the whole thing went to hell in a handcart. And they ain't going to get it. And that's going to make them mightily pissed off. I think people think it's going quiet and it's gone away. I suspect that we're just in the eye of a hurricane when it comes to the reaction to these troubled times.
Yes, I think we are, and I think we could expect to have a series of events moving towards some kind of consummation point. You know, I mean, we could be having a financial disaster, a environmental disaster. Our politics is unable to service in any kind of fair and just way, and our expectations are probably fairly unrealistic. But then on the other hand, given the diet that we've been on, this whole sort of soma that we've all been drinking, that's given us these delusions of and expectations that are totally out of step, if you like, with what you could have from a sustainable situation. I'm not at all surprised that we're actually in a mess. I'm not surprised we're in a mess.
It's really funny. We in New Zealand 3 years ago had an election where the main sort of cry from the then opposition who became government was to put a pretty boy who was good on photo ops up and get us to aspire to be like him, a multi-millionaire. And we managed to get people who, in my parents' generation, would have rejected him outright as a class enemy. Things have changed a bit. But they all aspire to be like John. They believe that they can take their, what I'd describe as extreme working class lives and actually turn those around and become wealthy at the expense of their fellow citizen. But they don't even see that as being the path. As a consequence, the expectation that these things can happen and will still happen is going to be the biggest stumbling block to the problems we face, because people just don't like being told that, hey, that thing which you really think you can get to and what you really think you can have is actually not available anymore. And that's the real worry for me. The thinking behind our particular election this time round is around, it's not so bad, and we got this nice looking strong fellow who looks good in the camera, and he's going to lead us to the promised land. And to do that, well, if he sells off all of our assets, that really doesn't matter, because, well, he'll get them back for us in some other format. What's actually happening is that a veneer and a facade is actually there, and the wolf has been let loose. It's slavering around wanting to take all the assets, give them to their friends and gnaw them up and leave us a few charred bones which we'll then sell on to the next buyer. It's actually a really, really foul scenario. But the people won't see it. And I think, well, we New Zealanders are so stupid, and then I realised, no, hang on, this is happening all over the world. It's happening everywhere. And I think the best example was what happened with Russia when it became a free market country. The kleptocrats took over. I think we must have learned from the Russians. They've taught us something, Everyone's a kleptocrat now. So.
Well, apart from a fox being in the public hen house, I guess there is a sort of underlying issue of we're well overdue reform of our currency and our financial and banking system. And the fact that the banks continue to actually dictate the money supply, and probably behind all of that, the big players, I'd suggest to you that the Bank of International Settlements is the biggest player, and then you have the various reserve banks of the countries of the world that are actually privately owned. So in the case of New Zealand, somewhat different, but we may as well be privately owned because of the way the Reserve Bank behaves. But in the US, of course, the Federal Reserve, privately owned, and really the Bank of England's in the same situation. So basically you've got huge banking financial monopoly dictating to the governments of the world, and actually, kind of we're prisoners to it. Ordinary working people are prisoners to the banking and finance system that we accept. And our behaviour is such that we are just blindly stumbling forward or maybe we're going backwards actually, but we're just struggling in a mist that a small group of people is exploiting. And it's sort of sad and tragic and almost funny at the same time. Because
it is really. It's a rerun of the end of the so-called Dark Ages, when the established authority of the empire and the established traditions and modus operandi of the tribal entities in Northern Europe really sort of came to an end, and they ended up in a feudal system where those who were pretty good at fighting and pretty good at sticking swords into people all of a sudden really just took over. And a couple of 100 years later, everyone was a peasant and a serf, or they were a man on horseback with a sword. And you can guess who ran things. And I actually see what the bankers are doing, and what the high-end corporate people are doing at the moment is actually acting in the same rapacious manner. They're creating a new serfdom, a new feudalism for us. And we've sat there with our cherished democratic institutions, which we subscribe to, but we don't actually partake in. And the only way we can actually take these people back out is to insist upon the rule of law, and to insist upon the role of democracy, and to actually practice it. Because if we don't do that, we've got nothing left to stand on. The major problem in the banking sector worldwide is an inability of the authorities to actually impose the law. In actual fact, the authorities have been corrupted and bought out, and consequently there are no legal sanctions which will ever be taken against these people. And at that stage you realise that the institutions, the democratic institutions we've adhered to, have become bankrupt. They've actually ceased to operate, ceased to be capable of operating. And it's a moot point whether we can actually resurrect them, or whether we actually have to remove them and rebuild them from the base up. But that is our only real alternative in a worldwide sense to what I describe as a new dark age of corporatism, a new dark age of feudalism.
Nick's actually saying something which is a bit more radical than a lot of people would like, but in fact he's using fairly diplomatic language, but really what he thinks is that we should grab a group of people and take them down to Civic Square and shoot them, because basically what's happened is that unspeakable criminal actions and activities and crimes have taken place against the people. And I guess if we had Abraham Lincoln here with us, he would be talking pretty much like we are, and in fairly strident terms. And he wouldn't be pulling his punches, because I read some of his speeches, and he railed against the banking system, and of course how basically what happens is that a small group of people have the monopoly to print money and charge the government for its use. And I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous the way that the wealth is distributed and the way that the finance. But however, this is actually just the battle for the power. The battle for ascendancy, and there seems to be very little recognition that actually all of the really important things that underpin a culture and make it worthwhile, namely the morals and the ethics that it runs on, are barely relevant now.
Yeah, and it's really quite funny, because a society's morals and its ethics should be reflected in its legal system and its political entities, etc. And I think we've reached a point with regard to the power structures in the financial world, everywhere where I can see it, where it's reached a level of corruption, a level of kleptocratic, how shall we say, violence against the citizenry, that the only real solution is for us to take that power back from them. And one of the keys to it, as I say, we were talking about democracy, is to make sure that the state themselves are the only people who can actually do things like fractional banking, the creation of money at source. To leave that in private hands is a recipe for disaster. What you've seen, the end result of it in America, where the Fed is actually a private institution, Bank of England, private institution, and all around the world where there are these huge banking agglomerates, is that they've actually managed to print a lot of debt and use it to convert the assets into their hands. And honestly, you have to ask where the bank robbers are. I think they're sitting inside the banks, not outside. You know, they're trying to smash their way out of the vault as opposed to in. It's all a bit much.
It is.
It's a bit depressing at times, and we're not on an upbeat move tonight, but
No,
we are actually stating it how it is. I normally laugh, but tonight I have this election on my mind, and
we're going to have possibly going to have a new. I don't know if it will have a change, but we'll have a new government tomorrow at some stage. And Nick, he's had a few problems, just like many people have. Only over the last few weeks, been kind of rather intense problems that the poor chap's been coping with. And I guess, you know, we can all feel at the end of our rope at times. We don't have any short rope at the moment where we could use, so we won't be hanging ourselves. But you kind of get the picture, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we should call it quits on this one, because I reckon our time's just about up for YouTube. Yeah. And well, hopefully the next time we speak, it'll be a brighter note. But don't hold your breath. We're still searching for a fair and just society, and along the way, we're still looking for a philosopher's stone, as far as I can see.
Yeah, and it's I'm just going to hark back to my favourite you know, man for the last couple of thousand years, a certain St. Francis, who led by example, and that's the only way to do it.
Okay, well, all that. Well,
Thank
there
you
you go.